All right, so I normally would spend some time credibility building at this point because the shape, the bag that carries around my brain is distracting to people, and it leads them to believe I am something other than what I am. I am a chartered scientist and an organizational psychologist. I am a geek and a nerd. Those are the important things for you to know. It's also important to know that a geek and a nerd, they are not the same thing. I am very proudly a non-executive director of the Manchester Health Trust, that is Trafford, Wythenshawe, Withington, and all the hospitals on the Oxford Road campus just down the road from here. I am running from here to there in a minute. I am interested in narrative. We've been passing, as a species, we've been passing on information effectively through storytelling since we crushed berries and sprayed our handprint on the walls of caves. This is how we've been transmitting information, and it's how we continue to be effective at it. But as I talk about narrative a little bit here and building inclusivity through it, I think it's important to know that I'm not just talking about your ability to tell a story. Part of the narrative is also the narrative you hold about yourself in your head, and indeed the narrative that you hold about other people in your head. I think, so I've done a couple of things in the last few days, and that is that I've gone around and I've done a little project asking the people around me about, in a very reductive way, about careers advisors and people's experience with careers advisors. And I've been warned that at this point you'll all roll your eyes because you know the stories that are coming. But I just thought, in this occasion, the narrative that I heard, that I'm sure you're familiar with, whether it be true or not, is probably painful for you. And yet at the same time, I think it's really useful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things that I heard. So just suspend your disbelief momentarily. Because I realized, having these conversations with my colleagues and friends, that this narrative about you is actually quite useful if you're interested in being better at reaching underserved communities, underserved children and adults. Because in some small way, for a group that is, if you look at yourself, reasonably homogenous, this might be one of the ways that you can walk in another person's shoes who is quite different than you. If I condense my experience of talking to my colleagues over the last more than a few days, actually, career advisors were essentially the butt of jokes about your collective utility and indeed your efficacy, and in some cases even your right to exist in a kind of resource-starved educational environment. People challenged that constantly. People felt that you should constantly have to justify your value in a world where people essentially think you'll be redundant because of AI in the next 3 to 5 minutes, or redundant because here you are advising people on jobs that won't exist or haven't been thought of yet. People think that careers advice is kind of obsolete, that this is perhaps one of those evolutionary dead ends like the dodo that needs to be allowed to peter out. Some of my colleagues, who are quite considerably more learned than myself, considered that many in the sector, or at least the sector itself, was kind of useless even before they were willing to hear what people in the sector had to say, to hear more about what they have to offer. And again, I'm not really here to suggest that this is a clear and accurate assessment of what you do. But I couldn't help, for the first time, when I looked at your websites and I peeked into the room, I thought this might be the first time that I can see some similarities between your experience and mine. Because you read that stuff, having to validate your utility, having to consistently help people understand what you have to offer, and welcome to being a minority a little bit. Welcome to that. The difference is, one of these is about your vocation, a choice of job, and the other is about the kind of skin you wake up in, the identity you have. But I think it's a really useful thing, whether it's a mischaracterization or not. I would actually bask in it a little bit. I would take it on board, because I think it'll make it easier for you to connect with some of the less well-served children and adults. My experience, like most people's with career advice, is pretty juxtaposed. In secondary school, I was taken into a room with our careers advisor, and I was given a color-coded box, and I don't really understand how any of that worked. But I do know that my prospective job changed with every grade that I got. If I did well in history, I was all of a sudden going to do something related to history, and if I did well in geography, I remember doing reasonably well in a biology test and being told I was now going to be a lab technician. And I know these are horror stories and ridiculous, but what was interesting for me is that my best friend Peter is a son of a surgeon and a red-headed white guy, and he was always Peter, and appended to his title was future surgeon. I mean, and not even future doctor. Let's think about this. Future surgeon. Whereas my career aspirations were always clearly tethered to terra firma. Never did I really excel to more than the level of geography teacher, which I can only imagine I would have been hideous at. And it was really interesting because I knew I was going to be a psychologist. I knew when I was 7. And I told everybody I was going to be a psychologist. And not once in my entire experience of secondary school was that ever acknowledged. Even though it led to my choice of O-levels and A-levels, all of which had a kind of, ooh, really, biology, chemistry, physics for you? So it's been an interesting experience, but what was great about it, and I think one of the things that's interesting based on some of the things I heard just at the very end, and I may have got them out of context, but there's a real temptation. I love the idea of being a high-powered academic, everything except for the research, probably. I always consider that's what graduate students are for. I'm an applied psychologist. So I've kind of dismissed that it's not going to be my future. But sometimes we look at our jobs and we get very protective of our academia, of our smarts, of our qualifications, and we think that this is the real key to what we have to offer. And I'm not suggesting that we should deregulate and have anybody do anything they want, but sometimes the key to reaching people, the key to making substantive change in people is nothing to do with the academics. It's nothing to do with that part. I went to university in America, and I remember meeting my academic advisor at Penn State University. And I walked in and I told her, hi, I'm John Amaechi. I'm going to be a psychologist. And what I need for you to do is to help me navigate a strange kind of student-athlete environment where you're not really a student-athlete, you're an athlete-student. And help me navigate this in a way that I can fulfill this dream, because this is the important thing. Basketball is a distraction until I do something substantive and worthwhile. And she helped me with that. And she did remarkable things with that, and none of those things can I talk to you about now, because I mostly don't remember them. What I remember is that we would sit and talk, and she realized I love words, and I love stories. And one day I walked into her office, and I spent time in her office. Probably, I can imagine I was a complete pain in her ass, because I was not necessarily supposed to be there for a meeting or anything. I just liked to spend time with her. I think in part because when I walked into her office, she could see me. She could see the psychologist. She didn't just see athlete. She didn't just see massive black guy. She didn't see all the things that most people see when they look at me. So I spent time with her, and she realized I love words and stories. And she asked me if I'd like to learn more words in a way that was neither patronizing or rude, but it was kind of like, I want to endorse this. And so I was like, why don't we do that? And she did. That's how she would, let's learn more words. And My enduring memories of my time with Sandy is lying on her floor with her in her office, getting out a dictionary, letting it flop open, putting a pin in it, finding a word. The first word I found with her, syllogism. Ridiculous, but I remember that. This was pivotal for me in terms of, and it's not traditional advice, and I doubt very much that this is something based in your deep-seated qualifications and expertise. This is the ability of people to see through the bluster, the nonsense, the stereotypes, the assumptions, to really see to the core of a person, not ignoring the fact that that person exists in the context of a person that once they leave that room, I distinctly remember opening that glass door into our office to go back into what was still an academic advising suite and then onto campus and realizing I'd take a deep breath because I stopped being a psychologist the moment I leave this room. There's a power here for us. It's something that I've really embraced over the years, the idea that if you can be a person that can see through the bluster, then you can allow people to really be more than they had imagined was their lot. I spent a lot of my youth with people telling me what I should do. It's really interesting terminology. You should do this. And I always think it's what really people really mean when they say that is what you're good for is. And people were constantly telling me, oh yeah, you should wash windows, because you know, tall. That was my granddad's career advice, by the way. I'm really a fan of obscure, very old, and probably redundant research. So I enjoy things like Cooley. Cooley's 1902 research on the looking glass self. Anybody familiar? I mean, it's ridiculous, but I love it. The idea that our identity doesn't just percolate as something that we develop over time, but rather our identity is actually made up of how we see ourselves reflected in the faces of the people around us. This is my constant companion, this piece of research. Because I know what people see, and it's not delusion, and it's not self-doubt, and it's not some weird convoluted imposter syndrome or something else. I know what people see when they see me. People have three main reactions to me always. The first one is terror. People are afraid of me. And it has a weird impact, actually, because if you don't want people to be afraid of you, many of you would think, actually, I'm sure, that there are times you want people to be afraid of you, whether it's your children at certain pivotal moments, or peers in your workplace, or bosses, whoever. But there is something actually quite crippling about the fact that everywhere you go, everyone is always afraid of you. The second thing that people do when they interact with me is that they mock me. They find me funny. They find me funny as a figure. So they laugh and point a lot as I walk down the street. And then the third thing is that when people talk to me, despite the fact that I am always considerably taller than them, when they talk to me, they tend to do that thing where they do this. And then they speak very slowly and use very small words. Because, of course, this is an idiot. And so throughout my youth, I realized very quickly that I am terrifying, mockery-worthy, and stupid. Some kind of weird, emotionally and intellectually illiterate monster let loose on the world. And it has an incredibly limiting impact on you. It means, actually, that you start pixelating the world around you. For me, I spend a lot of time pixelating everything below about 6'6". Because this way I don't have to see your face, and I don't have to see the look that you give me as we turn a corner and you're surprised. And even though you're a lovely guardian reading person who would never hold any of these views, the look on your face is of such fear that it tells me again that I'm the monster. So I just pixelate it out and smile, a very good neutral smile that I've developed over the years. The problem is when you do this, you miss so much. I regret my youth in many ways, but I missed so much because I pixelate. Even today I do this. And the charges that people mistakenly say are hard to reach, really are underserved, that need your support and advice, they are the ones who will pixelate most readily. They will know there's only so many faces. Think of it yourselves. How many faces could you tolerate examining at real depth if you knew that the majority of them would tell you something about yourself that A, you thought not true, misrepresenting, but also was deeply wounding to your own psyche. Some of the people who sit in your office because they're forced to, some of the people who sit in your office in the vain hope that they'll see the right thing will be the quickest to pixelate. And so it's not your expertise, it's not your brilliance that will stop them from doing that. It's your ability to show that you see them. The idea that in your face they see only benign ignorance. I do not know about you. That married with enthusiastic inquisitiveness. I want to know anything you have to offer. I used to live in Arizona in the summer times, in the off season, and I always thought it was amazing. I lived on the desert, and javelinas, which are like pigs with horns, would run by, coyotes, and the sunset every night to me was something remarkable. I would sit there and watch it, and I always thought it interesting that when people came from England, they would come and sit out with me, like in a hot tub too, like there's no small deal, and watch the sunset on the first night, and they'd be like, ooh, this is amazing. And then on the second night, they would sit out and they'd be like, yeah, this is cool. And then by the third night, they didn't even want to see it. And it was just interesting to watch how quickly people move from that space of, I don't know, but I'm really interested in knowing, to seen it, done it. And many of those underserved communities deal with people on a daily basis in a multi-agency way who have seen it and done it, and they don't believe that this individual is actually an individual. They are just a conglomeration of stereotypes and assumptions and everything else. This, to me, is the role that you can have. Being able to spot that individual and not just give them the most incisive, brilliant piece of your brain, but help them see that you see them, so they can be something, perhaps more than others expect. I told you I knew I'd be a psychologist when I was 7. And I used to work in a program called the Big Brothers Big Sisters, and I'm not even sure if we have it in this country, but in America it's quite pervasive, and it was my practice ground. Talk about being underqualified. My first charge was, I went in there and I said to them, look, I'm going to be a psychologist. I want your toughest kid. Just moron. And so they gave me this kid called Darnell, and he'd been struggling in school, very classic, lots of the things. His family background was chaotic. His schooling background was chaotic. Everything was chaotic. And I thought I had the answers. And I just remember talking to him, and I made the mistake that I think I'm hoping to stop you from making. I just thought that I was kind of brilliant, and I know my stuff, and I know you, and I know the right answer. And I don't even remember the interaction in terms of the words, but I remember standing with him looking at me, talking at me, and I remember everything about my environment. I was on campus at Penn State. I was maybe a second-year sophomore in university. I'd maybe taken 3 classes in psychology, which were all the ridiculous history of psychology stuff that allows psychology students to think they know everything. And he lectured me on everything I didn't know. He lectured me on my approach with him, on my patronizing approach with him. And it transformed my practice. It transformed how I thought about individuals. It transformed how I looked at people, always as individuals first, and realized that there was something more important in my connection to them than my own brilliance. I want to make sure that there's time for you to ask some questions, but I want to also point out one other thing that I think is important. And I don't know how much time I've got because I didn't put my timer on, so somebody will drag me off at the appropriate moment. One of the things about our practice, one of the protective things about being a practitioner, is that we must, in some sense, believe that we have opportunities for redemption if we make mistakes. And indeed, it's very convenient on a greater level to assume that not everything we do really matters. Indeed, for your particular part of this industry, it's very clear from the stories that my colleagues and friends said, many of them think that a lot of what you do doesn't matter. But it's actually quite convenient to believe that. And one of the things that I have learned through many of the little brothers and sisters that I have worked with through I started off in marriage and family therapy, if you can believe that, as a terrifying marriage and family therapist. Many of the charges that I've had and many of the people that I've worked with, I've suddenly learned that everything matters. We like to believe that there are pivotal moments. This pivotal moment theory, we can predict and prepare for the moments that matter with our charges. This moment matters, this half an hour today is important, this passing in the hallway is not. This is important, this is not. Because it gives us a great deal of comfort to know that we aren't human wrecking balls, destroying our environment with every glance. The problem is, we're human wrecking balls, destroying our environment with every glance. Many of you will know what it's like. You may work with somebody, or you may be that person, that you'll have that neutral face when you're suddenly having a thought about something, and somebody will walk across your gaze with your neutral face, and you'll see them stumble and look like, what? What just happened? They've just been caught in your neutral gaze, and now they're going to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes worrying about what the hell just happened, what they've done. We have that kind of impact on everybody all the time. Your expertise makes you disproportionately powerful. And so you have to think of yourselves very differently. And this is hard because, as I've mentioned, and as you already know, people demean what you do. And sometimes it's kind of cool to go with that. Now, if you're going to tell me I'm useless, that this is a redundant career, that we're all pontificating thises and that's, and we're not applied, or whatever it is that people say, it's kind of convenient, let's go with that. But you can't. Because you're disproportionately powerful. You have to think of yourselves differently. You have to think of yourselves more like I think of myself, just in a purely physical space, because I am an actual giant. Actual giants don't get to be quite so cavalier as you guys, tiny people. Right? You get away with a lot of stuff, let me tell you. Watching tiny people is like, it's like, remember the experiment in school where they put smoke inside a Petri dish to show you Brownian motion? That's what it's like watching tiny people. You're on your phone, you're talking to your colleagues, you're walking through the hallways, you're in a room, and it's just a constant sequence of bump, oops, sorry, bump, oops, sorry, bump, oops, sorry. That's all it is. It's just a constant sequence. And the thing is, it's because you're all relatively the same kind of tiny. You think conservation of energy, what's the worst that happens if I hit somebody? You know, no harm, no foul. And the problem with that is it leads people like yourselves to believe that if my physical interactions with this world are generally inconsequential, then my interpersonal interactions in this world will be generally inconsequential, recoverable from. And it's a mistake in thought. Everything we do matters. If somebody comes and stands next to me, I don't know why, but people do collect in my blind spot a lot. It's like I'm a reef or something and they're in my lee. But if I stand still for 5 minutes, somebody's going to be stood here and I have to be more vigilant. You may have noticed that my body language is pretty contained because I can't do big arm movements, because if you're stood here, you will die. And this is important to remember. How differently would you behave in the minutiae if you remembered vigilantly in every moment that you are a giant? How would your practice be different? How would the way when that person is leaving your room and you've got to rush somebody else in and you rush their exit, and then you rush the introduction and you're not really looking at them as you're looking at your screen as someone sits there, how differently might we behave if we realized every wrinkle of our behavior, every wrinkle of that interpersonal interaction could be the difference maker? Think of this, especially for those underserved communities, but indeed for all of them that you wish to reach. I do not think, I know your expertise is invaluable, but I do not think that is going to be the key to making the difference that I think you want to make. The story that I think you hate about who and what academic advising is in the public narrative, embrace it. In that tiny, small way, you have a coat that you can take off that others of us cannot. that helps you realize what it is like to continually have to validate what you know you're good at. Go forth and be giants. Thank you. You have time for a question?